Hi. It's been a while since I made a video because making YouTube videos is a lot of work and I'm very lazy. But we're back, and considering it's January, it's a new year, I thought I would tell you about the 10 best and 5 worst books that I read in 2024. I had an okay reading year. It's funny, I fall into the trap of comparing my numbers for 2024, where I read, I think, 74 books, to my 2023 numbers, where I read like 140. I have to keep reminding myself it's because last year I actually had a job and 2023 I didn't. So I had a lot of time to read whilst being unemployed. But even though I didn't read as much this year, I think the quality of what I read and my enjoyment of it was a lot more. There were very few books that just really I didn't like. And in contrast, there were so many that I loved that actually narrowing it down to 10 was very tough. And there are a few honourable mentions that I might make another video about, maybe. A book I had never heard of before I picked it up was These Stolen Lives by Sharada Keats. This is a YA dystopia novel. And I was actually kind of handed this to read because I work in a bookshop, and I was covering the person who runs our YA book club, and this was the book they'd picked. And I'm so happy they did that because I absolutely loved this. This is a world where people have to pay for the right to survive, but it's set in a country that's been colonized, and the people who lived there prior to colonization, they like owe back pay for the time that they lived before their country was taken over. They're essentially living as a kind of like indentured servitude in order to try and like make back that money. I think that this is kind of what like the current climate of YA dystopia has been really crying out for. It is like a really spot on commentary on colonialism, racism, late stage capitalism, and whilst it's really fun and it's a great adventure, it never like underestimates the intelligence of its younger audience. The main character in this, Mora, finds out that one of her friends has been accused of this crime and is set to be executed, so she enlists the help of Kit, and the two of them come up with this plan to break him out of prison and like get him to a safe place. Honestly, this has kind of got everything. It's got a heist, it's like a can't put it down edge of your seat thriller. It's got a really lovely slow burn romance, and whilst it is like very beautifully and like poetically written, there is no wasted word in here. Everything is there with a lot of intention, which is something I really appreciated. And I just couldn't put this down, and I really recommend it. Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen is wild. This is about a group of women who are on this show that's essentially The Bachelor, and they get taken to this very remote like North American island to film this like final challenge. And whilst they're there, they encounter a lesbian Sasquatch. It's hard to describe this because it's just so weird, but where I think a lot of weird fiction skews much darker and it wants to be like body horror, it wants to freak you out and make you feel uncomfortable, this is unapologetically fun whilst being completely bananas. It's like queer and campy and ridiculous, and it knows that it's all those things and it really leans into them. I read it in one sitting, which I am not a one sitting reader, so when I say that, it's like very effusive praise. But it just has a lot to say about like self-discovery and breaking through like societal expectations. And it's got a giant gorilla with a massive rack. So I don't know. If that's not going to convince you, I don't know what will. The Dry Heart by Natalia Ginzburg is for all of the Elena Ferrante, Sally Rooney girlies. And this feels also kind of like a precursor to Gone Girl. Natalia Ginzburg is one of those like recently kind of rediscovered classic authors. But so many authors like name drop her and reference her as an influence on their work all the time, and authors that I really love and respect, which is what got me so excited to pick up her work. I had told myself that I was going to do all of her books this year, and I didn't do it because I just kind of dropped off. I've also told myself this year that I'm going to read all of Joan Didion and Eve Babbitt's, like, in chronological order. And I don't know if I will again, but I'm trying. I read the first Joan Didion and I really, really liked it. This is a teeny tiny but intensely powerful novel about this marriage between a young woman and this older man, and the way that they kind of slowly break each other down and humiliate one another, and the way that their power dynamics play out until it explodes in this act of violence. On the first page of the book, she shoots her husband, and then she goes and sits on a park bench and just kind of has a think about everything that got them to that place, and also kind of why she put up with it all for so long. The prose in this is like very stark and almost cold. It feels like an assessment, like it's very piercing and it's very biting in its analysis, and it doesn't wrap things up in any kind of, you know, poetry or flowery language. It's just all kind of laid out for you, and you can make of it what you will. Natalia Ginzburg is not a writer who cares to over-explain herself or her characters. It's almost like she doesn't care what you think of them in like a very cool way, but they're so well constructed that you will think of them exactly what she wants you to. I would highly recommend this to anyone who loves like a female rage novel, and wants something that's like a very early, very formative example of that. I'm not gonna lie, Open Water was kind of a fail on my part because people have been telling me to read this since it came out like several years ago, and I've always been putting it off. And then this year I read it, and it was one of the most beautiful novels that I've ever put into my eyeballs. This is a love story between two young people who meet in a pub in London. They are both Black British artists. They both got scholarships to private schools as kids and kind of had to navigate that world. And it is just about the way that they very slowly, kind of circling one another, form this really deep and intense love and bond. This is about vulnerability. It's about finding the person who really gets you and allows you to be vulnerable, and then maybe messing that up a little bit because you're afraid. Pretty much like the first half of this book, which is, you know, a very tiny book, is these two characters just kind of ever so slightly inching towards the other, but they're both kind of too afraid to make the first move. They're each like waiting for the other one to show their belly first. And eventually something just kind of breaks open for them. And it is the most like stunning thing. This is a novel that's written in second person. Usually that is an enormous turn-off for me. I do not like it. And I don't think any writer less skilled than Caleb Azumah Nelson could have made me enjoy this book in that format, but it worked so well, and it just created this real like immersion that was so like gut punch potent. I know I'm, you know, not nearly the first person to recommend this. A lot of people have loved this and kind of have this on their radar, but if you've ever needed a sign to like finally pick this up the way that I needed a sign, then this is that. It is so sensational. Birnam Wood is the first Eleanor Catton novel I've ever read. Despite having all of her books for a really long time, my mum bought me The Rehearsal when I was in secondary school. I was like 14 or 15, and I don't think she knew what it was about. It was just that I was like a theatre kid and she thought it was a book about theatre kids. It's not. It's about a sex scandal at a school. So then she took it off me, and then I got it back, but I didn't read it. And I will read it soon. It really suffers from one of those like YA, very like mid-2000s headless girl covers, but they've recently changed it and the new one is really nice, so I might actually just replace my copy. I digress. Birnam Wood is really sensational. This is like a literary satirical thriller about a group of environmentalists. They have this kind of collective of guerrilla gardeners. They go to unused spaces in the city in Australia, New Zealand, I'm sorry. They go to unused spaces in the city in New Zealand that they live in, and they plant community gardens. The group is ostensibly leaderless, but it's really run by this woman called Mina, who has this dream of like making good. She thinks that they're going to have this huge breakthrough at some point and become this really powerful non-profit, and they're going to be able to make real change. And her motives are slightly unclear. I think that she thinks that she's, you know, a good and just and philanthropic person, but she's also deeply, deeply personally ambitious. And it's interesting to see the way that that clashes with the other members of the group. Because of this ambition, she gets mixed up with a billionaire and kind of takes the group to the land that he owns, believing that like this is their opportunity, but he is pulling all the strings and he's kind of using them to cover up something he's got going on in a national park. This is exactly the kind of thriller I love. It's very literary, it kind of moves slowly, but it's still super plotty and twisty and like bitingly funny. I think that it will really appeal to people who liked Yellowface. It's got that same kind of politicism and the same sense of humour. And it's also a multi-POV story. It's told from all of these different character perspectives, and they're all so like well fleshed out and well realised. And it's nice to see all of their different competing motives and ambitions and the way that they intersect with one another and create this series of events that none of them can really come back from. I'm definitely very excited to read more Eleanor Catton after this, though from what I understand this is quite different to her other books, but this was just an absolute like 10 out of 10 for me. Possession by A S Byatt is a book that I spent an entire month reading, and I'm very glad I did. It is big and it meanders and it's covering so many different things, and it's kind of a novel that is a lot of different things. So definitely one that I'm happy to have taken my time with and to kind of have really savoured and like really digested. This is about two British scholars at two different universities. They are each studying these different Victorian poets, and they discover a series of letters that would suggest a link between these poets. So they start working together and analysing these texts, and we go from them to the letters, to the poets, to the poetry and the work, and it creates this huge kind of web, this tapestry that you have to unpick the way that they are unpicking it to kind of find out what the truth is. At the same time, there's all of these outside interests, the way that there always are in academia, people with these competing motives, these very kind of morally grey individuals who potentially pose a threat to this work. I loved every second that I spent in these pages. I had to go back and reread sections over again because they didn't make sense to me the first time. I'm also not a big poetry reader, and there are huge, huge swathes in this of like epic poetry that A S Byatt is obviously incredibly skilled at putting together, but it's not really my area, and I was very excited to get more into it and kind of learn more about that craft. But this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. It feels like it runs the full gamut of human emotion and experience. It's witty and it's heartbreaking, and I felt kind of wrecked when I turned the final page. I just wanted it to go on and on. The characters felt like friends at the end, and I didn't want to leave them, which I think is the hallmark of like a really, really special book. Chain Gang All Stars by Nana Kwame Adjoin-Brenyah. This is a book, I feel like in 20 years we're going to look on this the way that we look on like The Handmaid's Tale or 1984 as kind of a seminal work of dystopian fiction. But I wouldn't wait 20 years to read it because it's so potent and so present, and it is absolutely feels like it should be required reading for now, especially with these times that we're living in. It is more important and more kind of necessary than ever to engage in these kinds of works. This is like an abolitionist dystopia. It presents a vision of the American political system where prisoners are given the option of competing in a gladiatorial fight to the death that's televised in order to try and win their freedom. This is a novel that I kept having to kind of talk myself down from being entertained by, because it really sucks you in and it pulls you into this narrative, and then you feel a little sick when you remember what you're reading. It's about dehumanization and propaganda and the way that people and the vision we have of people can be broken down so much and so intensely that we would be willing to watch them die as a form of entertainment. But even whilst this is like incredibly dark and incredibly serious and dense, it is also filled with a lot of love and hope and humour sometimes, very dark humour, but humour nonetheless, and kind of warmth and tenderness, and those things are balanced so well. It's trying to do a lot, but it knows exactly what it's doing, and it never lets go of any of those threads. It's holding everything really tightly. I just think that it is an absolute masterpiece. I read it on audio as well, and the audiobook is really, really sensational. It's got a bunch of different narrators, and it creates this very immersive experience. So I would really recommend that if you don't fancy picking up a paper copy. Though in any form, this is going to really shine because it is, it's like a blowtorch. Yeah, it's sensational. Portrait of a Mirror by A. Natasha Joukovsky is not going to be... Oh, God. Well, I was going to say... this is not going to be a novel for everyone, but it is a novel for me. I don't think that says good things about me. It probably says that I'm a pretentious loser. This is the Narcissus myth, incredibly loosely reimagined as a modern day novel of manners. This is about two New York high society art world couples and the way that they intersect and the way that their lives and careers kind of collide with one another over the course of this exhibition that one of them is putting on. I love a multi-format novel when it's done well, and it is done exceptionally here. This is emails and texts and phone transcripts alongside really vivid and beautiful prose. The characters in this, you just know that these are real people. Like, I mean, they're not, but they feel so vivid. And so irritating. They're just the worst. But I loved them, and I was really rooting for them, even as they are like the most annoying people I've ever read about. I think that's a very hard balancing act, and I think the author's doing that very well here. The quote on the cover pictures this as Gossip Girl meets The Secret History, and whilst I think that's potentially true, you could certainly call it that, I do think that's underselling it. This is doing a lot. It's a really interesting commentary on like wealth and class and status, and the way that people have to kind of contort themselves to fit into that, to keep it, and the expectations that are placed on them. So, you know, you sometimes feel bad for them, but the novel also never shies away from the fact that these are deeply privileged individuals. They are kind of, you know, choking on their own good fortune, all the while complaining about how hard their lives are. And somehow the author pulled that off without me hating them. So yeah, I think well worth a read, but very wordy, very pretentious. So if you don't like that, maybe you won't like this, but I loved it. I read so much good romance this year, but the real standout for me was The 7 Year Slip. This is another one that had been recommended to me a lot. This is, and I think Ashley Poston is really carving out a niche for herself doing this, these kind of slightly speculative, slightly magical realism novels. This is about a woman who goes to stay in her aunt's apartment and discovers that when she steps into the apartment, some of the time she will travel 7 years back in time. But 7 years prior, there was a young man living there for the summer. And it's about the way that they form this bond with his kind of 7 years prior self, and then she runs into him in the present day, his kind of new self. She doesn't think he remembers her. He obviously knows the full extent of their relationship whilst she's still experiencing it. And it's just about the way that people grow and change and how that can be scary, and you might not want people to change, but they do. And it's, I think, often always for the best. This is a book about how what you want and what feels right in the moment might not be what you need or what's good for you. It is about grief and love and moving on after loss and finding yourself. And I don't think Ashley Poston could have told this story or gone on that journey with these characters without a time-traveling apartment. None of her kind of magical elements ever feel shoehorned into the novels. They're always so distinctly rooted in plot and character, and they're always so necessary. So they never feel gimmicky or frivolous or trivial in a way that I think things like that often do. And last of the books I loved, the best book I read last year, like by such a long way. I've talked about it before. Everyone's sick of hearing me talk about it, both online and in person, and that is Fruit of the Dead by Rachel Lyon. This is an absolute knockout. It is the only Hades and Persephone retelling you ever need to read. I've kind of said to myself that I'm done with Greek myth retellings. I think they're getting very samey and just not that interesting. But when something is doing it this well and it feels this fresh, I'm still gonna be excited about this. This is Hades as pharmaceutical billionaire. He hires this young woman, Corey. She's a camp counselor, and he takes her on as the nanny to his children, whisks her away to his private island, and gets her hooked on painkillers. She is getting like sucked deeper and deeper into this very sticky web. Meanwhile, her mother is running up and down the East Coast, losing more of herself as she tries to find her child. This is like such a fantastic examination of like wealth, status, power dynamics in relationships, agency, what that actually means to have agency and to want to feel like an adult, like you're making your own choices, making these big decisions for your life, but not necessarily thinking them through. It's about parenthood and the kind of bond between mother and daughter, and it's also just like a sticky, sweaty, hot summer rich person novel. My favourite kind of book, honestly. There's something about like the very privileged doing their sticky summer things. I've said sticky too much, I made it weird, that I always really get on with, and that was no different here. This is a dual POV novel. It's Corey and her mother, and those chapters are so distinct from one another. They feel so disparate, but very obviously and very inevitably are like barreling towards the same point. That collision feels unstoppable. You know it's coming, and when it comes, it is something really spectacular. This, I think, is for fans of Eliza Clark, of Emma Cline, and I also just read her other book, Self-Portrait with Boy, which is just as good, and I would pitch that as if Sally Rooney had written boy parts. I'm kind of sad about this, that it's done, that I can't read it again for the first time, and it feels like it's going to be really hard to top this year. Like, it was just, it so blew me away. So those are all the ones I loved. Let's do what we're all here for. I know you wait until this point because you're grubby little rats like me and you want to know what I hated. So these are the worst 5 books I read. I mean, worst is a strong word. None of them were like terrible, except for one. They just let me down. They were disappointing. I was expecting such big things and didn't quite get it. So it's not that these were like just garbage books. Me and them, it just wasn't working. The Cloisters by Katy Hayes. The first half of this was amazing, and then the second half of this was a mess. This is about a young woman who gets a job studying as like a PhD candidate at the Cloisters Museum in New York. She's studying like occultism and tarot in the early Renaissance period. And when she gets there, she meets her professor and then the other student that she's working with, and gets kind of drawn into their very toxic and tangled relationship. This is super vibey. I loved those vibes. You know, it feels kind of moldy and smelly and like cold stone, candlelight, cloaks. I don't think there are real cloaks in the book, but it felt like there should have been cloaks. Just real dark academia catnip, and I fell for it. Unfortunately, the second half of the book, I then discovered that there wasn't really a plot in any sense, or not one that was going anywhere. It felt rushed, it felt nonsensical, and the real kicker for me is there was this kind of major character death that felt like it should have been the climax of the novel, but we learn about it in a phone call, like off stage, and it just it felt like kind of a disservice to everything the book had been building to until that point. It really sucked because this had so much potential and I was so sure I was going to love it. I was telling people how much I was loving it, how I thought it was going to be a favourite, and then I had to kind of go back to them with my tail between my legs to say, oh no, it wasn't, it didn't stick the landing, it didn't end up being very good. Fish Swimming in Dappled Sunlight is a really great premise for a book. This is about 2 people, they live together, they have this very close relationship, and they've gone on a hike and their tour guide has died and they each think the other one killed him, and this is kind of a bottle novel. I was going to say a bottle episode. I've been watching Community again. This is a locked room novel about the final night in the apartment and the way that that kind of tension is building between them. Unfortunately, the twist of this is given away in the first 30 pages, and the twist is incest, and it was very weird, but not weird in a good way, just a bit unpleasant. And then as soon as you know that, the book is floundering for the rest of its runtime. Not a lot is happening, and whilst there are real moments of like, oh, we're going now, the tension is building, it evaporates every time. So getting through it ended up being kind of a slog. Even though it's very short, I feel like I could have gotten through this in a day, but it took me a while because I didn't like it very much. The Four is another dark academia novel. This is by Ellie Keel. This is about a group of 4 scholarship students who are admitted to this very expensive, very prestigious private boarding school. And it's about them navigating this new world that they're in, that they're really unprepared for. This felt like it could have been really good. The publisher really went after this in a big way. They sent me like a big package for it with a fake Stanley Cup, and had like the whole London Book Fair thing. This was the one. Unfortunately, it just wasn't very good. The writing I felt like needed like another edit pass. It was quite clunky. It was quite repetitive in some places. But I think my real issue with it is this wanted to be a YA title. The characters in it are very young. They're kind of 15, 16. And some of the writing felt like it was maybe pitched to a slightly younger audience. But it was paired with these very graphic, dark, explicit scenes. And this one character in it, it was like a little life, you know? It was almost like kind of torture porn. It was so unpleasant. And those scenes, they felt very shoehorned in, almost as if they were there to bump it up into the adult category. And because they felt so shoehorned in, that they didn't really feel like they were handled very well or with that much care. It just all felt a bit gratuitous. This was a bummer. This year was a reread for me because I read it last summer, in the summer of 2023. I got like a very, very early proof of it. And I liked it then. I kind of read it in a hurry, and I went back to it because I wanted to go through it a bit more. And I realised that I had been foolish when I thought that I liked it, and I'd gone a bit carried away. And it's a shame because I think it had a lot of potential, but it was just kind of a miss. The book this year that I think I most wanted to like, because it was such like a darling, everyone loved it. It's stunning, it's got a really gorgeous jacket on it, it's a really, really cool premise, and that's Butter. This was probably my biggest disappointment. Not to say it's the worst book I read, but like I was so sure this was going to be a slam dunk, and it ended up being kind of mid. This is a Japanese translation. It's about a woman who is in prison for a series of murders that she may or may not have committed, and she is a kind of gourmet home cook with a very successful food blog. She is giving no interviews. The press is obsessed with her, but she will not engage with them until this one journalist reaches out to her and says, "Can I have your beef stew recipe?" And that leads the two of them into this very tight, toxic, intense relationship. And for the journalist, it's kind of a journey of like self-discovery and all of that. That should be so me. That, you know, that's an Annabelle book. But ultimately it didn't really go anywhere. This felt like it wanted to be a really weird book. It wanted to be super fucked up. I kind of assumed there was going to be cannibalism at some point, but no, it shied away from that every time. And there were many occasions where it kind of went up to the line and then it just backed away. And it felt, I don't want to say cowardly, that feels really unkind, but kind of that. It's packed full of really great commentary on like Japanese society and beauty culture and ageism and fat phobia. But the way that that commentary is presented is it just kind of goes over it again and again and again, and it just tells you again and again and again and hits you over the head with it to the point where I felt like I was being punished for paying attention. So I'm sorry if you loved this, if this was your favorite book. I definitely see the appeal. and I really wanted to like it, but this, it kind of did nothing for me. The last book I don't have, I read it on Kindle. I'm kind of glad that I didn't buy a copy of it, because this was a bad book. This was not good. The others were like fine, but I didn't like them. This was just, yeah. And that is A Hunger Like No Other by Kresley Cole. This was pitched as like the OG Bride, the kind of original vampire werewolf paranormal romance, and I loved Bride. I thought that was a really brilliant book, and kind of almost felt like the kind of thing Ali Hazelwood should have always been writing, like really get back to her fan fiction roots. I loved it, and so and she blurbed this, and I really thought that I was gonna love it, but I didn't. I hated it. Like genuinely, I hated every page. I only finished it out of spite. I wish I hadn't wasted my time with it, and I kind of hope that you don't either. This is about a werewolf called Lachlan. He is being imprisoned under the Paris catacombs, and then he smells his mate, and that smell like gives him enough energy to break out of his imprisonment, and he proceeds to just kind of chase her through Paris, trying to have sex with her. She wants nothing to do with him, and he kidnaps her and takes her to Scotland. Now, I understand that like in kind of dark romance, in other books, that kind of thing can be handled well and with care and in a way that people get a lot out of. This was not that. I think even if this had been remarketed as a dark romance, it still wouldn't have worked, partly because it's boring. The plot doesn't make sense. The events that do happen feel really sudden and out of place, and there are big stretches where nothing at all is happening. But I think its biggest sin is that I just didn't care about this relationship. There is no chemistry, there is no connection, there is never any building of a relationship outside of him wanting to drag her to Scotland. Also, the way that this man is written, very much giving American woman who's never met a Scottish person. It's giving Outlander. Didn't love it. But I didn't like them. I wasn't rooting for them. I wasn't engaged in the stakes or in their story. And I didn't want them to end up together. I wanted her to, honestly, I wanted her to kill him. Like, that's the twist I was hoping this would take, is that she would like stab him through the heart and run off and live her best vampire life. So, sorry. Yeah, this, I think it was originally published in the mid-2000s. I kind of think it should have stayed there. Those were my best and worst of 2024. Thank you so much if you've stayed this long. I hope you enjoyed them. I always feel weird like giving negative reviews, but it's also kind of fun. Stick around and subscribe if you want more. I'm filming a lot this week and I'm gonna have like more fun things out. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope if you liked or hated any of these books, let me know. I definitely would love to hear about them. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye.